Ever since Inside was released back in 2016, 10 years ago now, I've had it sit at the back of my mind, occasionally contemplating on it. But now, with how much the community has discovered over those 10 years, and the 10th anniversary being this year, I decided to finally give it a proper attempt at deciphering the game's meaning. Over the last nearly a week or so, I've been analysing and interpreting the game, which, fascinatingly, has led me to develop a multi-layered theory which I'll be covering in chapters. Said chapters will be exploring the theory in layers, each one will have a timestamp for convenience. The layers will be in this order: Layer 1, Limbo; Layer 2, the Shallows; 3, the Deep; 4, the Bottom; and 5, Silt. But before we descend, I need to give a foreword here. Keep in mind, Inside is very interpretive, evident from the countless different theories, analysis videos, etc. covering the game. However, there are certain themes and details that are clearly overt, which we will go over, albeit they too can be interpretive in a less direct way. And ultimately this is just my theory, so there may be issues with it, albeit that's something I talk about later. Anyway, with that made clear, now to begin our descent. This is Layer 1, Limbo. Starting with the surface, the Limbo layer of my theory, this section's going to be covering the obvious details and some of the less noticeable ones. Firstly, it's very clear the whole setting is a dystopian hellscape ruled by a dark organization. Anyone or anything that steps out of line is silenced or put down. Meanwhile, this organization carries out horrific experiments, creating slaves, abominations, and God knows what else. The state enforces its control with the obvious: attack dogs of the state, armed men hunting down escapees, giant security machines which the size of can be interpreted as a joke. Given, mass correlates to size, or the scope of something, but in this case mass is entirely applied to the device itself. Fairly ironic, given only one machine can cover a small area, which is possibly a commentary on the weakness of a surveillance state. In fact, they needed 2 of these just to cover a single elevator, which shows just how ineffective these machines really are. There are also scientists and workers serving whatever the state demands of them, usually moving slaves around in trucks or working whatever ungodly project they have in mind. And there are rows of sleepwalkers marching in line, doing whatever the state asks of them. Secondly, the game is connected to Limbo, given the existence of the parasite controlling the pigs. We see multiple dead pigs early on in the game, all very clearly infected by the same parasite. The presence of this parasite means Inside is set after Limbo and in the same universe. And said parasite could likely be how the mind control technology we use to solve puzzles in the game was discovered. I'll be honest, most people even familiar with Inside and Limbo on a surface level will know about all of this. If anything, most theory videos are built entirely off these and the stuff we'll be discussing in the next layer. However, I feel it's important to make that distinction here as we progress lower. Layer 2, the Shallows. However, what we see is not all, and in plain view even more hides if you pay close attention. People wearing masks, adults and kids alike, these background people, some seen during the movement test, all wear the same masks. Why? Possibly to hide their identities, or to represent a loss of identity and individuality the system around them would demand. And we have the actual experiments you'll encounter. First is the albinos, faceless slaves you control through several sections of the game. These unnaturally indestructible humanoids have no free will of their own, only doing what's instructed by whoever wears the mind control helmet. Given the places we find them, they clearly exist as an artificial labor force mass-produced for heavy-duty work regular humans are physically incapable of. Meanwhile, they are commanded entirely by a singular person. You also encountered deformed, broken, failed variants of them in the labs later on in the game, making it clear that they are the result of horrific human experimentation, and are likely the result of research based around the parasite from Limbo. The second is the aquatic creatures in the flooded labs, which we'll be calling the Sirens. For what purpose these creatures exist is unknown. They could be experimental state agents made to smother out dissenters in the most literal way possible, or some attempt at exploring flooded areas as the setting seems to be soaked with heavy rainfall in some areas, likely a consequence of the rain machine in Limbo being activated. However, considering the dictatorial themes, I feel they probably represent the state trying to smother any opposition by the metaphor of drowning. albeit one of them, for some reason towards the end of the water section, drags you down instead of letting you die, revives you and lets you breathe underwater, using a device as almost umbilical cord-like in design, which fits with a theme we will go over later. And then we have the game's signature monster, the Huddle, a grotesque, horrific amalgamate of albinos. There are many theories surrounding its existence, albeit there are a few definitive things we know. First is we know this creature has escaped before, evident from a Polaroid that, given time to develop, shows the creature walking around, having escaped its containment. Plus, a miniature model of it can be found as an Easter egg. There's also the diorama towards the end of the game which shows exactly where the Huddle is going to end up. And the observation room where you reach upwards for a box only to fall to a pit of water as a crowd of researchers watches you in the dark shows that this creature's breakouts are predictable. It's something that they've grown to predict at this point, and they are studying every time it does. It's clear the Huddle, the Blob, Amalgamate, whatever name best fits this unholy aberration, it has escaped before and is being studied, and its existence serves some kind of purpose to the organization. We already know by now the theory of the entire game being a test. Most people who are familiar with Inside will have known of this theory. The Blob and the boy in an endless loop as discussed by other channels. Albeit outside of this, I feel the Huddle could likely have another meaning. The Huddle could be a horrific representation of collectivism, or is the end product of the destruction of individuality, which frankly to me at least fits the theme of the setting well, especially when you consider the masks, the albinos and the sleepwalkers. However, gameplay wise, on its own, the Huddle is a nameless, faceless collective awaiting something to drive it. I feel this too could fit in with how the creature lacks any individuality, as it just seemingly does nothing until you encounter it. And regarding a fan theory about the Huddle controlling some of the monsters, like the mermaids for example, I mean, hypothetically it could be due to the helmets that are placed on the Huddle, albeit it doesn't seem to make sense to me, because if that's the case, why do they try to kill you except the one at the end? If the Huddle is truly trying to get the boy to reach it, the mermaids trying to kill him goes completely counterintuitive to this. If anything, the mermaids should be clearing obstacles to try and make it easier for the boy to reach the Huddle, but no, they actively try to impede him. Except the one at the end that actually keeps him alive and saves him. Essentially, this conflicts with the whole purpose of the Huddle if the Huddle is truly controlling the boy as some think. On a related note to that, in my honest opinion, the Huddle is obviously not controlling the boy, given that the cornfield basement ending reveals the machinery controlling him. I'm going to be showing a close-up shot of the model to show a better idea of what you're looking at, meaning the boy is likely either controlled remotely or by an AI lore-wise. So yes, all of Inside is part of a deliberate test, but this brings us down into Layer 3. Layer 3, the Deep. Every part of Inside is part of a deliberate test, but to what end? The Blob becomes controlled by the protagonist and by proxy whatever is controlling him. In the case of the gameplay, you are controlling him. But in the context of it all being a test, I suspect the Blob is being gifted a higher intelligence via you and the boy, but for what purpose? Well, if the control helmets on the Blob are any indication, I suspect naturally it's being used as a nexus for mass control over the slaves we control with helmets throughout the game. Essentially, it's possibly being used to mass streamline the on-site labor if they can get it to stay still and not break out. But while that's the obvious reason, I suspect, given how grand the entire setup for the test is, that there is a much larger, more nefarious scheme at play. What exactly, I'm unsure what their goal could be. World domination? Managing insane numbers of workers and soldiers? Erasing the idea of individuality by creating a hive mind, which seems most likely given the repeat themes of identity being erased? The detection of dissenters via some psychic blob? I'm very unsure, but it's safe to say it's probably being used to work on a large-scale project with the worst intentions. At this point in my theory, the whole thing being one large test yet clearly designed to be interpretive as a game made me initially come to two conclusions. One, it's simple as, it's dictatorship 1984, it's all simple and surface level. Or two, it's an abstract amalgamation of ideas and themes that all in the end form into something larger. Either a huddle of concepts like the game's iconic monster, or all of them as one form into something singular and meaningful in layers. But ultimately the only way I could test this and see which of these it was is to see where the themes connect and if it holds any water. But to do that, I had to first make a list of themes and see where they connect, which is when I came up with the following list. Inside could represent the following. 1. The obvious dictatorship and endpoint of absolute state control, the end of individuality. 2. The beginning of a revolution and fall of a dictatorship. 3. A criticism of collectivism, Marxism, class war ideology and its inevitable endpoint. 4. The cycle of dictatorship if the blob is part of an experiment to further the state's control, of course. 5. Fertilization, pregnancy and birth. The umbilical cord-like device the mermaid used to give us the ability to breathe underwater, and the blob's holding chamber vaguely resembling a womb, sort of add to this as well. 6. The power of individuality, the boy's entire journey. 7. The status quo and how nobody really questions it, they just accept it, evident from the boy being the only character to show any free will at all. 8. The illusion of choice, something the Bioshock franchise touches on very well. I absolutely love those games, may do a video on them. But ultimately, with this list, I began to try and connect ideas, to see what stuck and what made sense, and what didn't, which is now something I'm going to go over. The first is the birth symbolism and the dictatorship stuff, which could technically be interpreted as being anti-natalist. Especially considering the boy, the main child, is used to further the nefarious research of the organization and exists in a world that is hellish, one that you would certainly not want to be born into. Albeit given children do exist in the background and they are just subservient to the status quo, wearing masks and are not being used to create the blob and seen to be separate from the mindless sleepwalkers, it seems that the anti-natalist idea is not the intended idea as there's very little backing it, so it's fair to say that this is not one of the intended themes. Second is the pro-Marxism theory, which I'm going to say now is exceedingly dumb. As to why this is even a theory, the boy is wearing a red shirt, a colour commonly associated with communism, anarchism, left-wing ideology generally, but this theory quickly falls apart given the blob only kills the CEO, even then he can move out of the way if you wait, and considering the building and tests are still going on after the revolution, the metaphor literally falls flat on its face, as the blob instead escapes and the cycle just repeats. This leans more towards a sort of anti-CEO or anti-corporate anarchism idea, but even then it falls flat as the blob's actions are ultimately inconsequential. If anything, it seems to show that those kind of approaches are just meaningless and don't do anything. So it's safe to say that these are not what the game is about either. So there is evidently very little chance of it being political revolution related. However, I feel the game is more a warning about dictatorship, socialism, collectivism, and the loss of individuality. Thirdly, as to the birth and pregnancy symbolism, it's all pretty obvious, especially with a recent discovery about the game, which I want to give a shout out to Oddheader for covering this in one of his recent videos as I write the script. Someone hacked the game and found a function called give birth, which triggers an animation where the blob spits the boy out, albeit the animation is clearly unfinished. And while this is cut content, it was probably intended for an ending, which in turn adds credence to the theme of pregnancy and birth. Again, thank you to Oddheader for covering this, by the way. That said, combining the theme of reproduction and dictatorship, it seems to imply a life finds a way or survival against all odds theme to everything. Essentially, the indomitable human spirit in the face of everything, challenging even the illusion of choice, a theme the game is heavy with given the nature of the loop. But do any other themes fit in? Revolution technically does, albeit not in any specific political sense, instead in the human innate desire to push back when we are trampled on. A criticism of authoritarian ideology does, evident from the nature of the setting. Fair to say criticism of the status quo does, evident from how the boy, despite our player control, is the only one with any level of freedom, as he is also able to go under the cornfield and break the cycle, both of which feed into the theme of rebellion and the indomitable human spirit. The power of individuality does, evident from everything so far, and ultimately the entire thing, the game and lore at this point in my theory was initially set up for two types of viewpoint, the lore game viewpoint and the interpretive media literacy viewpoint. Essentially at this point I saw two interpretations. The entire thing is one big test led by a dictatorship for its own gain, or two, it's all a metaphor for the indomitable human spirit and survival in the face of overwhelming odds against it, or a mix of both. Which, given some time to think, both is why I ultimately decided would make the most sense. However, this brings us down to layer 4. Layer 4. The bottom. At this point in my theorizing, I initially said, well, that makes sense, surely that's it, right? Only to realize, everything being one big test, the fruitlessness of it all clashes with the indomitable human spirit, so I got to thinking and realized something. One could argue the everything is one big test idea of the setting essentially means everything he did is for nothing, leading into a nihilistic theme. Essentially, nothing you do matters. But, to counter this, on a second replay of the game, you can deactivate the machine under the cornfield if you did all the secret collectibles, which for the boy to do this would mean he has knowledge of each past run, and, by that logic, each past death, which would explain how he learns to avoid obstacles going forward, and how to get through all of the tests. However, pulling the plug below the cornfield deactivates the boy too, albeit seems to break the cycle. One could see this and interpret it as he gives up and ends it all because the struggle meant nothing. But given the repeat themes of the indomitable human spirit, I feel this more represents him realizing the only way to truly break the cycle and the tests and to end the Sisyphean loop, he has to shut it all down. Does he know this will kill him? Probably, albeit this likely means nothing to him at this point given the situation he's in. Assuming he knows, he probably feels it's the only way to end it, not out of a suicidal "I'm done", but out of a rebellious "fuck you, I'm out" mindset. Assuming he doesn't know, he's pulling the plug not knowing it's going to end the loop. Again, both can be interpreted as him pushing on regardless to break free of the test and his control. And assuming the worst case scenario that unplugging the machine did nothing and the cycle repeats, this puts the boy in a Sisyphus situation. Ironically, the blob rolling down a hill at the end could represent this idea. It's his proverbial boulder, the boulder of Sisyphus. But ironic and fittingly enough, this further adds to the theme of the indomitable human spirit, which brings me to, again, what I think could be the conclusion as we sink into Layer 5. Layer 5. Silt. At this point, essentially, I feel it's about the indomitable human spirit, albeit pushed to its absolute extreme, which to me ties all the layers of the theme together. The lore, the world, its deeper implications, its themes, and its message. Regarding the message, it brings together everything. I think it's about no matter what, never giving up. Life will find a way and continue no matter what. Even if it's a brutal cycle, it continues. Essentially, in the face of all odds, fuck it, we bowl. Which, funnily enough, we ball quite literally in the case of the blob. Kind of funny, really. However, while the message was supposed to be the final section here, I'm falling. I feel like it's been coming for a while, but it never does. Deeper into the earth, into dirt and rock and vein and sinew. This quote from Venus from Psychopomp fits how I feel on this theory so far. Despite this theory, I feel there's something wrong, missing, or overlooked. I suspect it goes deeper too, but to what extent I don't know. There is lore-wise definitely more going on, especially with the Limbo connections, and the ARGE for Playdead's next game gives us information on where the plot could be going. It's definitely something to do with a rover on another planet far out in the universe. In fact, as I write this, I checked their website and the third game is on there, albeit they are hiring and the game appears to be still clearly in development. Albeit I am very unsure on it given we know basically next to nothing on the next upcoming game's lore. Even then, I still feel like Inside has more to uncover. For example, I've barely touched on the cut content as most of it's unusable or barely intact, and those that do exist already lean into obvious things we feel and suspect about the game already. Which is why, dear viewer, I need to ask you for help. I need your theories, your input. Maybe someone else can see what I'm missing here. Hell, maybe I'm not missing anything and this is really just it. But ultimately, I do not know, hence why I'm asking you. But sadly with that, I now stand on the bottom among silt and sand. This is as deep as the theory goes. I try to dig deeper, but really, the water's just getting muddier every time I try. Yet, I can see it maybe, just maybe, goes deeper. And maybe it's about time I send it back to the surface and rethink all this. This is all just my theory, but I want to make a distinction. Unlike Matthew Patrick or game theory, I want to make it clear this is all just a theory without this disclaimer being reduced to a catchphrase out of sheer repetition. So I will say this exclusively once. But anyway, before I go, YouTube has this strange new hype feature. I'm not entirely sure what it does, but I think it's supposed to help you get seen more. From what I've seen, it's only seemingly accessible on mobile, at least for me, but I would suggest giving that a go. Also, I have a Discord linked in the description. But anyway, I'm gonna go back up to the surface. I'll be waiting for your comments if any. If they help me look deeper, I'll come back down and make a part 2 to this, but with that, that's all for now. Goodbye.